we're ready to get started for the afternoon. If y'all want to take a seat, we always try to make the agenda so that we have some of the most popular talks after lunch to keep you awake. We do have dessert coming mid-afternoon to give you some sugar to keep your energy up as we move through the program today. But super, super excited to introduce the next session. When we look at the issues that organic farmers face, weed management always comes up as one of the top challenges. So we always like to get some of the best speakers that can help address topics related to weed management. And this year is no exception. We are thrilled to have Dr. Joel Gruver join us virtually. Joel was not able to join us today in person, but he is here via Zoom. And Joel always gives just such great information with the program that he runs down at Western Illinois University. I know many of you know Joel and have seen Joel present at organic farming conferences across the region, but for those of you that do not know Dr. Gruver, he joined the faculty at the School of Agriculture at Western Illinois University in 2007 and teaches a wide variety of soil science, crop science, and conservation classes. In addition to teaching, Dr. Gruver is the director of the Western Illinois University Organic Research Program, and his research interests include conservation cropping systems with a focus on cover crops, organic grain production, soil organic matter, and innovative teaching methods. So it is absolutely my pleasure to introduce and to give the podium virtually to Dr. Gruver.
Hello, everyone. I wish I could be with you, but circumstances did not permit. So let's get started. So I enjoyed finding this picture online. I think it's a great example of somebody out enjoying the winter, obviously with a cow as well. But it's what I thought of when I thought of this concept of this is a good time to think about things, good time for pondering. So what should we be thinking about? Well, one of the key things when we are making decisions for our farm is to understand what is the context for making decisions. And you can see listed around this slide on the top a bunch of physical types of context. And then at the bottom, I think a very important part of our context is our human resources. Obviously, some of these things are very set in stone and other things are much more dynamic. But the context that we have creates the opportunities as well as challenges for implementing new strategies. What types of strategies are we thinking about? Well, in this presentation, our focus is the integration of weed suppressive cropping systems with direct control practices that fit your context. And by direct control practices, I mean things that directly kill weeds. Weed suppressive cropping systems are things that reduce the weed pressure and promote the competitive advantage of your crops. The reason why you want to think about your context is there are some systems and practices that work very well for other farmers, but are a poor fit for your soils, your topography, weed types, scales of enterprises, human resources, or maybe the markets, the things that you are able to sell. Field days and conferences like OGRAIN are great opportunities to listen to experts and to network. But visiting successful organic farms when they are performing key operations is even more valuable. So it's great to go visit a farm when they have a field day, but it is even better to visit a farm when they are doing critical activities. Obviously, we need to respect the time and attention that the farmer needs to put into their operation, but seeing what they are doing while they're doing it is really important. This picture happens to be one I'm really fond of. We had a farmer come down from northern Wisconsin, more than a 5-hour drive, just to walk behind as we were cultivating. But I think he took away some ideas that he could never have taken away from just a PowerPoint presentation. When farmers contact me with questions about organics, I normally start by identifying every organic farm in their county and adjacent counties using the USDA Organic Integrity Database that you can see here. And it's really easy to search. You can search by state, search by certifier, search in lots of different ways. But this is how I make those lists of organic farms that are near a particular farmer that contacts me. What are we trying to accomplish with this? Well, we want to learn what is and is not working in the area where that farmer is located. But we're not just trying to make a list of facts about, what practices are used, what tools do the farmers have. We're also trying to develop supportive relationships because relationships with other farmers are invaluable. We all need mentoring on our organic journey. This is a journey. This is not something where you ever have arrived and know how to do it all. There are lots of people out there that can be mentors for you. And that's what we need to find. When I think about someone who's been a mentor for me, one of the quotes I will always remember is this idea expressed here on this slide. The idea that success in organics is highly dependent on both skill and will. And success is obviously partly about the practices that you use, to a lesser extent in organics about the products you use. But let's focus in a little bit on what I mean by skill and will, because I think this is really important. Skill is not just how well you operate equipment. Skill is how you prioritize what's important, how timely you are able to get things done, and how well you integrate practices, in addition to how well you operate equipment and do those other things that are key aspects of skill. Will is your commitment. And we know that organics, we have challenges sometimes when the weather is just not cooperating. The real riddle, I think, in organic farming is how to have a very high level of expectation and at the same time not feel too beat up when things don't go your way. That combination of setting really high standards, expect that you're going to get excellent weed control, and then roll with the punches when things don't always go your way. That's a tough combination, but that's what I strive for. Some farmers are always looking for the missing puzzle piece on their farms. They're looking for that new technology. Some people repeatedly ask me, so do we have that organic systemic herbicide yet? Do we have, that super precision guidance system? An alternative approach is to focus not just on that missing technology that you can just fit in without changing anything else, but rather, how do the puzzle pieces on your farm fit together? What can you do to create a lot of different factors that help your direct control practices to be more effective? So how can you create a system where the practices that directly control weeds are more effective and that you are less dependent on direct control? I'm going to read through some rather wordy slides, the next two slides, but I think they do a good job of summarizing the key concepts that we want to think about in this presentation. Effective PWC, physical weed control, requires a systems approach to weed problems. In practice, this means that PWC relies on prior application. Before you're actually doing the physical weed control, prior to it, you need to have done agronomic practices that reduce weed emergence through use of preventative methods such as your crop sequence, primary tillage, false seedbed techniques, blind cultivation, cover crops, and also reduce weed competition through cultural methods that improve crop competitive ability. For example, choosing the right crop genotypes, using transplants in some cases, sowing or planting pattern. So how you orient your rows or space, your populations of plants. And then maybe even your fertilization strategy, whether you are banding fertility right with the row. So the key idea there is that for the direct physical weed control to work, you need to have done some things in advance to set you up for success. This is another quote that I think also says the similar concept in fewer words. And these quotes are from publications that you might want to track down and take a look at. But the aim of weed management strategies in organic farming is to maintain weed populations at a manageable level through a range of husbandry approaches throughout the rotation, so that direct control actions within individual crops have a greater surety of success. So just to wrap this up before we launch into it, we're trying to figure out how we can set ourselves up with prior activities so that the direct control practices can finish the job. What I have listed here is a set of factors that I think have directly helped us improve our weed management at the research farm that I manage. And the ones at the bottom are the direct control practices where we are directly killing weeds. But the way we set ourselves up for those red practices to work is really important. And I think I've actually been at this 18 years now. It's hard to believe. But through improving management of both cover crops and crop residues, we have created better soil tilth, soil that will crumble. Part of that is using standard cropping systems like corn, soybeans, small grain with red clover, but also we've been looking at alternative cropping systems, no-till cropping systems, solar corridor systems, high biomass fallow systems. Those we have integrated with more standard cropping systems. We've also done a much better job of planting our crops using higher quality planting equipment. And when you have better soil conditions, when you have better stands, then all of the other direct control practices work so much better. So let's just think to start with about where we come up with, our arsenal of direct control practices. This is an old publication now, published more than 2 decades ago, but it's still a free download, great publication, and it's nice to have a hard copy, but you can also get it online. And the focus is on steel, direct control equipment. Lots of different tools are discussed, lots of different specific types of tools, that might be high residue, might be standard, fit your system. And then there are also components of your tools that you might want to tweak to adjust how your particular tool functions. But to move on beyond the steel, I think this newer publication has some great information, and I just want to dedicate a moment to remember Chuck Moeller. Chuck Moeller passed away in 2021. He wasn't able to witness his 15-year-long book project that resulted in this Manage Weeds on Your Farm, a guide to ecological strategies. But he was somebody that we all owe a debt to, a great thinker, and someone who was understanding the science at a high level, but also very practical. And what I want to emphasize here is he started as a plant community ecologist, somebody who wanted to understand why it is in natural plant communities, why it is that we have the particular species that we have. And he tested this through very careful field work in natural plant communities. But of course, we have species that assemble themselves in our agricultural fields. And people have been thinking about this for a long time. Why do we have the weeds that we have? What do those weeds tell us? And this is a book that you can see it has 5 stars on Amazon when I captured this image. It's full of all sorts of interesting anecdotal information, but it's anecdotal information ripe for testing by the next generation of Chuck Moellers and innovative farmers. From my perspective, this is not information that is very actionable. This is information that is intriguing, it's interesting. What we need to think about is how to translate this type of information into practical weed management strategies. And I guess I I am all ears. I'm interested. If you are using this particular book or other sources of information about what weeds are telling you or how weeds respond to certain soil conditions, I would love to hear about how you've made that a practical strategy. Research by people like Chuck Bowler have gone beyond natural plant communities to looking at some of the interactions, for example, fertility interactions in our crop fields. And one of the key concepts is that it's complex, but there are some weeds that are very highly responsive to the availability of some nutrients. And I know that's very, very general. Without delving into the specifics, the basic idea is that when we build up very high fertility, for example, apply a lot of manure, we give the competitive advantage to some of our weeds. For example, giant ragweed. Weeds that have really high ability to take up nutrients and to grow really fast, they're able to get a competitive advantage when we over-apply manure. We also know that some weeds respond in terms of their germination when there are very high fertility levels. So that is kind of our background. Let's delve into kind of some overarching strategies. When we create cropping systems to control weeds, we have two main priorities. We're trying to increase crop competitive advantage. We're trying to reduce weed pressure. So how do we give the crop the competitive advantage? One key concept is planting later. Now, not necessarily planting later by the calendar, but planting later than maybe our neighbors are planting, because we need our soil to be warm enough for rapid crop emergence. As we'll discuss a little bit later, we also need our soil to be warm enough that we have had growth of some weeds that we can terminate before we plant the crop in most situations. We want to be able to prepare a good seed bed, weed-free, favorable for uniform crop emergence. We want to optimize planter performance, consistent depth, often greater depth than maybe conventional farmers are using. We want to have good down pressure, closure of slot, all of those aspects of optimizing planter performance. We want to accelerate crop canopy closure. That's choosing crops like corn that are big, tall plants, but also choosing genetics that maybe are more leafy, more rapid to develop that canopy. We also want to think about populations. Over the last several years at the WIU Organic Research Farm, we've been planting higher populations of corn, and I'm feeling very good about that. We used to normally plant around 30 to 32. In recent years, we've been planting 34 to 36,000. And there are some corn hybrids where that might be a little high, but with our soil conditions, I'm feeling like that's been progress. Adjusting row spacing, that could be wider or narrower. There are reasons for both. Applying seed treatments or banded fertility. The key concept here is that we don't really want to promote weed growth. We want to promote the growth of the crop. And if we can do that preferentially by putting fertility right with the row, or putting a biological treatment, for example, right on the seed, maybe we can get that preferential growth of the crop. Okay, so that's the crop competitive advantage piece. We want to also focus on reducing weed pressure. And of course, a key part of this is optimizing performance of your direct control equipment, your cultivation equipment. And I think we all know that we can adjust our cultivator to perform better, but a key part is also the timing of our cultivation. We want to target the weakest links in the weed life cycles. And as we'll discuss shortly, blind cultivation is a key part of targeting those weak links. We want to prevent weed seed production. And obviously part of that is strategies, rescue strategies like weed zapping or walking of crops, maybe even terminating excessively weedy crops, using those crops as forage or for grazing or haying. But also a key part of preventing weed seed production is just changing your rotation up so that you are rotating through a different type of life cycle that doesn't let weeds get to seed. And then this last line, I think, is really important in terms of thinking about the ecology of weed propagules, seeds or vegetative parts. We want to promote things that eat those weed seeds, those plant propagules, that decay those weed seeds and propagules. And we also want to really think about dormancy, how to manage for dormancy as something that we use as a strategy. Let's get into that dormancy concept. I don't think there's any way you can know enough about dormancy. Dormancy is very complicated. There are all sorts of publications about it. I think that this particular publication from Iowa State needs a little edit. It says weeds are consistent problems in agriculture because of seed dormancy. I would change that to weeds are persistent problems, because what dormancy is all about is survival. It's about being able to persist. And so the extent to which we understand how dormancy works, we're able to intervene in ecologically effective ways. And so I just have a few terms on here that I'm not even going to talk about, but to understand dormancy, we need to know what is regulating it. What's causing weeds to wake up? What's causing weeds to go into a deep sleep? This is a little more accessible, a little more accessible publication. Manage the weed seed bank, minimize deposits, maximize withdrawals, and does a great job of discussing a bunch of dormancy related concepts. One of the most obvious things anyone involved with agriculture knows is that tillage triggers germination. But how does that work? Well, we know that many weed seeds are triggered by exposure to light, exposure to higher oxygen, triggered by temperature fluctuations, and all of those things tillage contributes to. I sometimes joke about this as swatting the hornet's nest. Once we have done tillage, we then have a bunch of weeds that have been stimulated, and we are required to respond if we want to, control those weeds. Another approach, of course, is to avoid swatting the hornet's nest. And of course, Dr. Silva has done lots of great work on this. The no-till strategy is where you're minimizing swatting the hornet's nest, keeping everything as dormant as possible by keeping those conditions, low light, low oxygen, low temperature fluctuations, as uniform as possible so that weed seeds don't germinate. But of course, we also want to think about tillage as a tool for triggering weed germination when we want weeds to germinate. There are several different ways that I've heard this described. One is the false seedbed technique. Some people call it the stale seedbed technique. But the basic idea is we want to grow the weeds as much as possible and then grow the crop. Or maybe you should say, grow the weeds before we grow the crop. The basic idea is we want to promote as much of the germination that's going to occur that year for the weeds in our soil seed bank before we fit the field for planting our crop. So essentially, we want to grow as many weeds that we can terminate before we plant the crop. And there's some nice concepts here in another publication related to this. You can see the 3 golden rules. 85 to 95% of the seed in a seed bank have innate dormancy, meaning that they just are not going to respond to environmental conditions. Most of the other weeds, the 5 to 15%, will quickly germinate if they experience the right environmental conditions. Our goal is to get that 5 to 15% awake and then terminated before we plant the crop. That's the concept of the stale seedbed or the false seedbed technique. I think false seedbed is a nice way to describe it, because basically we create what seems like a seedbed for the weeds. They germinate and then we terminate them. So it's false in that it's not the seedbed for the crop. There are lots of other interesting concepts related to dormancy. This is a research article that discusses a bunch of different factors, but we know that nutrient levels, light, temperature, different gases, presence of residue, depth of burial, even the type of tillage implement impact how weeds wake up and go dormant. And basically, an understanding of these types of factors creates opportunity to exploit these types of factors. One thing that I think is pretty well understood, there's a lot of research literature on this, is that many seeds are responsive to the presence of nitrate. So when we have more abundant nitrate in the soil, nitrate is a form of nitrogen, many weed seeds actually will germinate much more rapidly when there's a higher presence of nitrate. We also have an interesting effect where when there's more nitrate, the mother plant tends to produce seeds that have less innate dormancy. So more of the seeds are ready to wake up the next season if the mother plant is exposed to high nitrate levels. Whereas if it's the opposite, if the mother plant has low nitrate availability, then more of its seeds will be dormant the next season. Of course, there are other nutrients that also impact germination. And in the, I guess, kind of the farm community, I've heard lots of discussion about calcium possibly impacting weed germination. There is surprisingly little scientific literature about this. In fact, this particular article shows that there was no impact of calcium on the growth of large crabgrass, on the germination and subsequent growth. So, I'm not saying that calcium has no impact, but there has not been much documentation of that in the scientific literature. It's something that we need to investigate more, because there's certainly lots of farmer observation that suggests that calcium may have some important impact. We also need to remember that it's not just about chemistry. When we use amendments like compost, we change the biology in soil in a way that's different than when we use amendments like liquid cattle manure. This particular study found that when they used compost, they actually had substantial reductions in weed seed densities in the soil seed bank, especially hard-coated seeds such as lamb's quarter, Chenopodium would be lamb's quarter, were reduced in soil where they had the compost amendment that resulted in higher microbial biomass, higher soil carbon. And so this was, clearly an effect that was biological and was different where they used compost as compared to liquid cattle manure. Okay, let's just get down to some really practical concepts now. What I'm looking at out in this picture is a view of a big flush of weeds. The question in my mind when I see something like that is, have I waited too long? I want to see a big flush of weeds before I prepare the seedbed for planting the crop, but I also want to make sure that my last pass is capable of fully terminating all the weeds. So you need to think about, if you use a field cultivator, for example, for your last pass, do you have your sweep set properly? Do you have the right weather conditions so that that last pass is able to fully terminate conditions that might look like this? That's going to kill a lot of weeds, but also it's going to leave a lot of weeds if you don't have the right tool or weather conditions to get the job done. This is what I want to see. Less than a week after planting, I see corn emerging rapidly and uniformly. But I also see a soil surface that looks the way I want to see a soil surface look when emergence occurs. What's going on in this view is described in this publication. This is now, I think, over 2 years old, believe it or not. But this was a publication I worked on with the OGRAIN crew, and it's called Blind Cultivation for Early Season Weed Control in Organic Grains. And it builds on some of the ideas that I had, I think, first read some of the farmers on the East Coast that were writing about using blind cultivation, kind of laid the foundation for this. But I think this really is a unique publication that pulls together blind cultivation concepts that maybe haven't ever been assembled in as much detail. And it's available on the OGRAIN website. The basic idea is there are different tools that can be used. A rotary hoe is a very valuable tool. A tine weeder is another valuable tool. We're using both of these. They have different contexts where they fit. We are doing more and more high residue cropping systems where a tine weeder just does not fit well. Our rotary hoe, we found that it was doing less and less. And so we just last year replaced all the springs. We are regularly replacing the spoon wheels. And we're finding that with the right, I guess, configuration and the right components on the tool, our rotary hoe is now performing better than ever before. Tine weeding has worked well for us, especially in soybeans, both pre and post emergence. It's an aggressive tool when set aggressively. Obviously, it can rake residues. It can also damage seedlings. With soybeans, where the plants are, first of all, quite resilient to the aggressive action of a tine weeder, but also soybeans are able to fill in when you have a lower population. If you have more space between the plants, but good growing conditions, soybeans are much less negatively impacted than what would happen if you compromised a corn stand with a tine weeder. Here's the key concept. When you have blind cultivation shattering a crust, you get the most action of all. However, blind cultivation doesn't have to have a crust. There are other ways that you can make blind cultivation tools more effective. If you have more micro topography, this is kind of an extreme example, but basically by setting the residue managers on the planter really aggressively, we created these ridges and valleys. And then when we ran a rotary hoe, just a single aggressive pass, the leveling action moved a lot more soil, controlled a lot more weeds than if we had started with a very smooth field surface. But essentially what we're trying to do is two different things. We're trying to kill weeds that have not even emerged yet primarily, weeds that I generally call white root weeds. But we're also trying to create a loose, dry soil surface environment, sometimes called a dust mulch, that is unfavorable for weed germination. Both of those are really important when thinking about how blind cultivation fits into a system. You're not just directly controlling seeds or seedlings, you are preventing seeds from having favorable growing conditions for germination. Of course, you're only preventing until the next rain or the next wheel track across the field, but giving your crop that extra, maybe just one day, maybe an extra week, whatever you can give, whenever you can give that competitive advantage to the crop, that's desirable. Okay, so that's blind cultivation. I encourage you, if you haven't looked at the OGRAIN publication on blind cultivation, to check it out. We go into lots of detail about how to do blind cultivation as effectively as possible. And I think blind cultivation really is an underutilized approach on too many organic farms. Or if it's being used, it's not being used as effectively as it can be used. Let's move on to row cultivation tools. There are lots of tools out there that we haven't tested. I have experience with a specific set of tools. A high residue buffalo cultivator is what we had when I first came, and then we shifted to this modified IH-153, which greatly improved our ability control in-row weeds. And then, in the last 4 years, we've moved on to a newer cultivator. But the key concept is any cultivator can control the weeds between the rows that are being undercut and desiccated. What we're trying to achieve is control of those inter-row, between-row weeds, and also to control the in-row weeds. Controlling the inter-row weeds by desiccation to control the in-row weeds by burial. There are all sorts of things that can be done to help your cultivation tools fit your context. This particular IH-153 was modified so that it's extended, it's much longer, and that allows for more residue flow. You can see this, in this case, we are comparing a no-till system on the left with conventional till on the right. We've added other components, and this particular tool we worked with Gary McDonald. Some of you know that name. He is certainly someone who's been a mentor to me, and you can see on those gauge wheels, we also have cutting coulters, and that helped with stabilizing the cultivator laterally, but it also helped with cutting vines, cutting weeds, so that we ended up with better flow of plant material through the cultivator. Obviously, cultivation is easiest when you have low weed pressure, but a high level of in-row weed control is possible. And I don't know whether you could see that from these pictures, but this was a field where we had some untimely rains, some rains that prevented us from doing the blind cultivation. We had a lot of weed germination that set us up for a challenging first row cultivation. But the key concept is that first row cultivation is when you can get the job done. After the first row cultivation, it's much more difficult to get in-row weed control. Not impossible, but much more difficult. The first cultivation is where you really need to focus on precise flow of soil into the row. To get that precise flow or accurate flow, there are some new tools available. And this happens to be one that we've now used 4 different prototypes of this tool. Isaac Martins in Iowa developed this tool, and it's worked great for us. I wouldn't say that it has more capability than our old IH-153. When the old IH-153 is set right, it can really perform well. What makes this tool so much easier to work with is that it is so adjustable. It is very easy to watch what's happening with that soil flow and to quickly make adjustments. Whereas with the IH-153, we had to use wrenches. With this, we have a series of basically latches that we're able to see exactly where we have it set, so I can tell somebody else, put it on the 3rd notch, and we're able to easily bring it right back. If we've made a modification for one field condition, we can bring it right back to the previous setting. That was not easy to do with the IH-153. Anytime you're entirely reliant on the human operator to control your position in the field, you end up with operator fatigue, and it's just hard to do good cultivation for a long time. Obviously, some people have a very high level of skill, but what we're trying to do with any guidance system is to improve the cultivation by reducing operator fatigue and making it easier to watch what's happening behind you rather than just focusing on steering by looking ahead. There are lots of different guidance systems out there. Some of them are very, very old school that have been around for decades. Some, of course, are very high tech that involve cameras, involve GPS guidance. You have to find what is a good fit for your context. The point is that you can improve the performance of the exact same cultivator if you have the right guidance system. Of course, as I mentioned, there are old school guidance systems that are out there, and this just refers to one of those. This particular approach is where you actually are creating a furrow while planting, and then you're able to have your cultivator follow that furrow or that groove. And this is old school, but this is low cost and can be highly effective. I don't personally have experience with this, but I've talked to a number of farmers that really found this to make a huge difference in their ability to effectively cultivate and cultivate tight to the row. This, to me, is really what it's all about. Your goal with cultivation is to give the crop the jump that it needs to get much taller and close that canopy over the weeds. And for that to happen, you need to have a good stand of crop, and you need to have conditions such as favorable fertility for really rapid growth after you've finished cultivation. So let's think about how to start right. As mentioned earlier, it's not just about direct control of weeds. Starting right is about having the right soil conditions. The soil that's going to crumble when you are cultivating is so important. You, of course, want to also make sure that you prepare a weed-free seed bed that will allow your planter to perform optimally, give you a good stand. And that, that's partly about soil conditions. That's also partly about how your planter is set up and how carefully you monitor your planter to make sure that it's performing well. You want to plant the straightest rows possible because obviously cultivation is easiest when you have straight rows. And so we actually have been cultivating now for 2 years where the cultivator tractor had guidance, had RTK guidance. But prior to that, for about 10 years, we were cultivating all with manual steering, but we were planting with RTK guidance, and it made the manual steering so much easier. Once your crop is established, even before it's emerged, if there is any possibility you want to blind cultivate pre-emergence, and then you want to blind cultivate again, if possible, post-emergence. But it's not just following the calendar. It's not just every 4 days from my perspective. It's about understanding your soil conditions, the tools that you have, and fitting blind cultivation to your context. But blind cultivation is targeting the weakest link in most seeds is between germination and emergence. When you have a seedling that has started to grow but hasn't reached the surface, it's very easily controlled mechanically. And with the least effort, the most rapid speed across the field, you're able to control the most weeds with blind cultivation. And then you want to take that first row cultivation very seriously. That first row cultivation, as I said earlier, is when you have the opportunity to control those in-row weeds most effectively. After you've done that first row cultivation, the weeds that survive tend to be propped up by the soil that was thrown in, and they're just much more difficult to control, even if you throw a lot of soil into the row on the second or third cultivation. For cultivation, which is really all about, particularly the killing process, is all about drying out or desiccating weed roots. You need the soil to crumble off of the weed roots. For that to happen, you need to have good soil tilth. If your soil is really cloddy, it's just really difficult for the cultivator to effectively desiccate the weeds. So obviously, I think we know timeliness is important in many different aspects of agriculture, but certainly for cultivation, effectiveness of cultivation. I love this picture because it reminds me we were racing that day to get cultivation done before a thunderstorm came in, and we were, as you can see in this picture, we were feeling a great sense of success. We got all the corn cultivated. This corn was cultivated just one time, and that one pass done at the right time before this rain came in was highly effective. just to say it one more time, that first cultivation is far more important than subsequent cultivations. Our experience is that often with corn, one cultivation done at the right time is sufficient. Now, of course, timeliness is very difficult when you have increasing frequency of extreme weather events. And my guess is that if I were to ask for a show of hands, I can't see your hands, but if I were to ask, essentially all of you would say that you have experienced multi-inch rain events in the last decade, maybe even multiple multi-inch rain events in the same season. That used to be much less common. Our research program is primarily receipt driven. We do get grants, but primarily we need to sell our grain to support the program. And so we've had to adjust. When we had these increasingly frequent rainfall events that were making it so challenging, we had to make some adjustments to our practices. These are 4 things that we tried to do: to be more nimble in utilizing our windows of opportunity. Nimbleness, of course, is maybe also referred to as agility. We wanted to be able to quickly respond when we had a window of opportunity. We also, the next 2 kind of fit together. We started thinking about how to diversify our crops and cover crops in alternative cropping systems. We'll briefly talk about a few of those. And we also started using more precision technology that would allow us to do the field operations more efficiently. We now start cultivating when the crop is still very small, sometimes, not always, but when there's a window of opportunity, if there's weed pressure, soil conditions are fit, we cultivate earlier than we ever did before, especially for soybeans. We also are looking at some crops that can be planted much later, late planting, even as late in our location down in Western Illinois, as late as mid-July. We were able to bring a sunflower crop to harvest, and anything planted in mid-July has much, much less weed pressure than something planted in May. We have not done very much with some of the strategies that I'm about to show you, but there are certainly tools out there, and some of you are experienced with them, direct control tools that are less sensitive to moisture than steel that's trying to desiccate a weed. We've never used a weed zapper system. Obviously, these systems are out there. Probably some of you have used them. What we need to think about is how to make these systems work most effectively for us. A high level of weed pressure obviously makes this, can overwhelm the system. Obviously, weeds need to be taller than the crop. And when that has occurred, you've already had a significant effect, negative effect on the crop. So what I'm about to describe are a few techniques that are being used over in Europe, and I'm not actually aware of these techniques being available yet in the United States. It's possible they have been brought in the last recent months, but there are ways that we can actually control weeds that are much smaller. This is a specific approach being used in sugar beets over in Europe, and that's something that we need to look at, using electricity to control weeds that aren't taller than the crop. Another really interesting approach that's being used in Europe is spraying an electrolyte solution right in front of using a weed zapper. And the basic idea is you improve the conductivity of the crop, your ability to impart the voltage into the crop. And when you do that, this particular approach is actually being used to desiccate potato crops, to desiccate, a solid stand of vegetation that without spraying on that salt solution, that electrolyte solution, there would be an excessively high power requirement. But with that electrolyte, they're actually able to kill a large amount of biomass. Maybe even a solid stand of cereal rye cover crop could be killed if you have the right conductivity. I'm going to just talk about this very, very quickly because I'm running out of time, but We have had a lot of success with organic no-till soybean production, but I guess the key concept is you need to have an adaptive management approach. You need to know when to pull the plug. If you don't have enough rye or other cover crops established to, serve as a really strong weed suppression, you should not proceed. If you don't have enough moisture for the soybeans to establish into the rye or other cover crop environment, you should not proceed. The other one thing I want to emphasize about no-till is, I think this is stated quite clearly in this Amazon review, too much about the roller crimper, not enough about no-till organic farming. What we need is to focus on the cropping system, the system that can get the job done, so that we have less dependence on the mechanical parts of this approach. And obviously the crimper is a key tool, but as stated here, it's not the end all for no-till farming. We need a cropping system that sets us up for consistent production of enough cover crop, and then a good environment for the soybeans to grow in. And then one of the key things we've been focusing on is what should follow no-till soybeans. And we've been trying to figure out how to make corn work following no-till soybeans. And that's been, a process that we're still working on. Our specific experience is we never do no-till organic soybeans following corn anymore. We think that's too high risk. We try to follow small grains or peas, and that allows us to plant the rye or triticale or other mixes much earlier, and we end up just with a much more consistent weed suppressive cover crop. To wrap us up now, I want to talk about something that is really what I think is our most exciting research that we're doing. This particular article is by the Nordells, legendary organic vegetable growers in Pennsylvania. And they have stated in the title what they have developed, what they have refined is a very, I think, effective strategy. Weed the soil, not the crop. They have developed a systems approach where they greatly reduce weed pressure in their fields such that they have much less dependence on direct control of weeds. And the way they do it is, a mix of practices, but one key piece is they have bare fallow periods, and then they have cover crop fallow periods where they are reducing, where they are having lots of weeds germinate, and then they are having extended periods of soil building where they are promoting the soil biology that tends to lead to more decomposition and predation on weed seeds. Okay. And their approach in horticultural crops is they split their fields. So every other year they have fallow, and then they have their cash crop. And this is a work in progress. So they've been at this for probably at least 40 years, I think, and certainly have probably refined it beyond what you see in this diagram. Lots of information is available online. The Nordells don't specifically do a lot on the internet, is my experience, but lots of their articles are available, and I encourage you to track them down if you're intrigued. There's lots of other information out there about this concept of using fallow to reduce weed pressure, and it's a highly developed approach in many tropical areas. This book, Restoring the Soil, describes it in lots of detail. But just to wrap us up here, our experience with this fallow approach actually came out of a failed no-till organic soybean system. We had a very weedy soybean field where we just decided to pull the plug. So it was August. I just decided I wasn't going to let all those weeds go to seed, and I tilled them in. The next year, we grew a fantastic corn crop. It wasn't just a high-yielding corn crop. It was a really easy corn crop to manage. Low rate of manure, one one blind cultivation, one row cultivation resulted in over 220 bushels per acre. That opened my eyes to the fact that a strategic approach, not just an accidental approach of this, might be the way to go. And we've written this up in an article that I'm happy to share. The basic idea is you might want to call it a regenerative year. I tend to call it a high biomass fallow approach, but you are focusing for an entire year on building improved soil conditions that will allow you to grow a really good corn crop. And it wouldn't necessarily have to be a corn crop, but that's where we have been focusing, how to grow the best corn crop possible after having a year of soil building. Of course, you have no revenue that year that you're doing the soil building. You have to crunch some numbers and see whether that makes sense. We've tried to crunch those numbers using an enterprise budget tool, and we found that if you have the kinds of yield responses that we've actually achieved now several times, it really can pay for itself. So, there are enterprise budget tools available online. Iowa State has one. Probably OGRAIN has one. I encourage you to crunch some numbers and think about whether this could work for you. Don't want to share any more results right now because we're still working on compiling them, but this is just a visual that I think shows you the kind of thing we're doing. This is a diverse high biomass mix that we rolled down, and then we actually planted some cool season cover crops into it. And I guess the key concept that I want to leave you with is to follow with corn. If you're not going to put on a high rate of manure, you really need to have plenty of legume in your mix. And we're still learning how to do that. Where I'm most excited right now is what we have going on out at the research farm. Planted last fall is some really high biomass mixes where there wasn't that much legume last summer, but we have a great stand of winter peas, no-till planted into the high biomass. And I think we'll get the synergy of the high biomass peas this spring following the high biomass, lower legume mix last summer. And I'm really looking forward to growing some good corn this coming season. The very last thing to leave you with is high biomass cover crops are easier to justify if you have a way to capture some direct value out of them, like grazing them. And, when thinking about how to diversify your cropping system, bringing livestock back to the land is a great strategy to think about. And this documentary from PFI, Practical Farmers of Iowa, is a really nice presentation of these ideas. And the very last thing to think about is there are many organic farmers that are excellent at weed management. You want to learn from the ones that are doing it poorly as well as the ones that are doing it well in terms of learning what not to do. But in terms of doing it well, we put together this document now more than 10 years ago. It's available actually on the Ohio State website, so you can track it down. But we're interested in doing some new case studies where we interview people that are doing organic farming with not just good cultivation, but the combination of setting yourself up with all the prior practices that create less dependence on your direct control strategies. And if you have a story to tell, we'd love to interview you. So with that, I will stop, and hopefully I have a minute for, maybe a minute or two for questions.
Thank you, Joel. Great information as always. We have a break built in, but I do want to give folks time to an opportunity to ask Joel some questions. If you have any thoughts and questions in terms of some of the weed management approaches that Joel's outlined. So as before, if you want to come up to the mics at the front of the room here. Any questions for Dr. Gruver? All right. Is that all right? Good.
Hi, Joel. This is Matt Ryan. Great presentation.
Hey,
Yeah, thanks for that. I was wondering about your suggestions about planting late, and if that applies for spring small grains as well.
That's a good question. That has not been our approach. We are trying to plant our oats, are the main spring small grain that we grow, as early as possible, and we've had the best success when we can make that happen. So we we are targeting planting oats as early as the first week of March. I think one time we even planted in February, and that's where we've seen the best results. So there may be other contexts where later planting of spring small grains might fit, maybe in a more northern climate. But in our location, for there to be favorable pollination and grain filling conditions, we really find we need to plant as early as possible.
Other questions for Joel? All right, I think we're good, Joel. Thank you so much for joining us virtually and making the effort to be here and share your knowledge with us. It's always such a pleasure to hear what you're doing at Western Illinois University. So let's give one more round of applause for Joel.